Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I welcome Mike Pantile. Mike is a dedicated Christian husband and father. He is a self employed fitness professional, a personal trainer, an online coach, and a gym owner. His life is centered around helping others become better, fitter, stronger versions of themselves, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Mike is also passionate about writing on masculinity, marriage, and fatherhood. Mike lived a reckless life before becoming a dad, and quickly after his wife gave birth to their daughter, his heart was softened and his life changed for the better. Through the process of writing and idea exploration, his main objective is not only to help himself become a better Christian, father, and husband, but also to help others in the same way. Mike feels like he's on fire for everything he does, and he would like to give all glory to God for the blessings he has. In this episode, Mike and I talk about forgiving our fathers. We both talk about why we must have forgiveness for others to move forward in our lives and be better parents to our children. The aspect of forgiveness can hold us back and prevent us from genuinely embodying our awakened self. Please find Mike on Instagram at Mike Pantile. And if you could leave a 5-star review at the end of the episode, I would truly appreciate it.
All right, Mike, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for coming on here and doing this with me. I'm super, super grateful. And I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have today. But before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, tell the listeners where you are and what it is that you do.
Furkan, thank you very much, brother. I was looking forward to this conversation after our phone conversation a couple of weeks ago. So my name is Mike Pantile. It's spelled Pantile, but it's pronounced Pantile. I live in Edmonton, Alberta. I just moved here a few months ago. And so other than being a Christian, a father, and a husband, I am also in the fitness space. So I do for a living. So I own a gym in Vancouver that I operate remotely. I have an online training and nutrition business, and I do personal training here in the city as well. So, I call myself, funny enough, a professional meathead, but that's pretty much what I am.
Awesome. So how is it like, I guess I'm interested in knowing how you're running your gym remotely. Like you don't need to be there physically. It kind of works itself out and you're just very hands
Yeah,
off.
it's a pretty yeah, sorry to interrupt you. It's a pretty unique situation. It's a small membership base. So it's like it is my personal training is private studio. So it's like 1,200 square feet. And so the members that are there are my old clients. And my whole point is not to make it like this huge money maker. Obviously, it still makes me money, which is great, but it's more so still to just be of service to my community, to those people that were so loyal to me for years and years and years. And, it was one of those things that we all kind of discussed, put our heads together, and essentially it's a private membership club where they get, training and nutrition parameters sent to them weekly via spreadsheet. And we have a WhatsApp group where we all kind of keep in contact. And like I said, the primary driver and motivation for that is not money, but it's just like service to the community. The added benefit of obviously, still being able to pay to keep the doors and the lights on. So that's how I operate that. And it's pretty straightforward. The people that I have down there are so trustworthy that, it's pretty hands off for me, other than, dealing with, paying rent and utilities and whatnot. It's pretty, thank God, pretty hands off.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's super cool. Thanks for sharing all that. But yeah, I guess when we chatted a couple of weeks ago, as you mentioned, we talked about many things, and one of the things that resonated for me is, I guess one of the things I've been covering a lot on this podcast, whether it's subconsciously or I don't know what's going on, but we've been talking about a lot of kind of the rites of passage for men and like the hero's journey and these archetypical stories that we all kind of go through in our lives. And one of the things that jumped out for me is around, I think, forgiveness. And part of it is healing the relationships with our parents. I guess one of the things we talked about was having that level of forgiveness for our fathers. And it's so crucial. I know I had to do that, and it really helped me move forward with my life. It almost helped me. I was carrying this burden around, and I didn't know about it until I actually faced it and dealt with it. That it really allowed me. And looking back now, it's really enabled my growth exponentially, because I was able to kind of get rid of that burden and that weight I was carrying around. I don't know if that resonates for you or if your experience was similar, but I
Dude,
wanted
yeah,
for that.
absolutely, man. I think that's something that plagues so many men nowadays because, once you remove the fathers from the household and when they remove themselves, what identity and what sort of, container of leadership do we have? Right. It's like, I refer back to that Fight Club quote, when Tyler Durden and he's talking to the other guy when he's in the bathtub, he's like, man, he goes, if we have no fathers, like, what is that? I'm paraphrasing, what does that, mean for God? God hates us, God's abandoned us,
Mhm.
our earthly, father is not there. So, that's a representation that obviously God doesn't have us in his favor, but I don't believe that for a second. And so just like you, I was carrying this burden. I didn't realize I was being shackled by this weight for so long, also the thing too is I think so many men out there have fooled themselves to think that they've actually forgiven their father, but they don't
Mm,
actually know what it means to actually forgive. And I'm
mhm,
I'm starting to I'm learning that more and more in my faith walk and my walk as like, father and as a husband too. And I don't know if I'm 100% all the way there, but I know, with each day that God gives me more wisdom, I am getting closer to that. And for me, like, I'd love to hear about how you've reconciled that with yourself and your father. But for me, it's like just accepting that, he's just a man. He's a
mhm.
flawed man. And, likely whatever he passed on to me was probably passed on to him from his father and then his father. It's this generational thing. And what's beautiful about technology in this social media era is that we're aware of this stuff. So now we can kind of attack the problem head on, right? Because
Yeah.
this cycle of generational trauma is a very, very real thing. And so the only way I've been able to really deconstruct that is through my faith. Is really
Mhm.
through, the softening of my heart through, I'm a Christian. And so with each week that passes in my faith, I come closer to this understanding of he's flawed. He was, damaged by his own father. And so he likely didn't forgive his own father. And he's just living his life the only way that he knows how. And there was also, I'm not sure about your situation, but with my father in particular, there was, an overbearing mother that didn't have there was no boundaries. And so
Yeah.
I still hear this excuse to this day. And it's amazing, like from even family members, I don't hold it against them at all. It's like, oh, it's not his fault. It's his mom's. It's like, dude, I can't imagine a more like pathetic excuse for a grown man
Mhm.
to like, you know, to have not launched his life and spread his wings. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
it's hard to answer that question directly, but I just know that, the more that I pray, the more that I get closer to Christ, the more I realize, hey, he's a flawed man. He was hurt by his dad. And it's up to me to sort of break that cycle with my own daughter. And that starts with understanding that he's flawed and
Mhm.
that he couldn't help it past a certain
Mhm.
point. So
Mhm.
that's where I'm at with that. So, and for yourself, how did you realize that it was this thing that you were carrying around that was there, but you weren't aware of?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you asking me the questions. No, um, it's interesting because I started going for therapy. So I was going through my divorce 5 years ago, and I was seeking therapy. And once I was kind of able to deal with what was happening in the moment, all the stressors, I started kind of healing my past. And fortunately, I was able to uncover a lot of things that I had been carrying from the past. And for some reason, I was really compelled to um, talk to my dad. And it's funny because there's enough experiences from childhood where it's like I could easily have the same conversation with my mother, which I haven't yet. But if for some reason I was more compelled to have that conversation with my father, and I remember specifically visiting because they live in a different city, really making an intention and telling him, "Hey, I want to sit down and chat with you." And when I sat down, I was scared because I wasn't looking forward to it, but at the same time, I didn't have any expectations. And what was beautiful was I was able to put, eh, as I didn't get into every specific detail, but it was I was able to put a lot on the table. And to your point, my dad didn't respond with defensiveness, which really helped. He admitted his vulnerabilities and flaw. And like as you've alluded to in your kind of experience, it's hard not to have compassion and empathy for a person who's just saying, "Hey, you know what? I wasn't the best. I made mistakes and I'm sorry." Like, how can you not forgive someone like that? And if you can't, then you're basically, um, taking on that poison yourself, right? You're going to carry that resentment when the other person is just saying, "Yeah, you know what? I am flawed." So that really helped not only our relationship, but it's helped me move forward. And as a father myself, it's allowed me to just tell my son all the time and remind him that, hey, I'm flawed. I'm making mistakes. I'm trying to figure this out every day. And I'm using whatever you indicate to me as feedback. But I'm hoping that as he gets older, he's able to hopefully share whatever I've done to impact him. And I'm hoping I can have that opportunity to apologize when he's older. So that was kind of my experience in a nutshell. But it really propelled my growth on this journey as well. Just having, I think you kind of go through these different, I would say, obstacles on your journey, and how you respond and deal with them. Sometimes it takes you a really long time to get through those obstacles, but it's really having that ability to be humble and continue to try. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to put it, man. I appreciate you sharing that story. I think one of the things that has plagued me, has been difficult for me. And when you sat down with your dad, I'm not sure if you had expectations, but I remember before I moved here to Alberta, we
Mhm.
moved here, we met up, and I haven't seen my dad in a long, long, long time. And, he's, to be completely honest, he'll probably listen to this once it's out. And I'm just not the type of guy that wants to slander anybody anymore. Like, I don't have a
Mhm.
resentful heart. I'm not like
Yeah.
angry in my heart. So like, I'm not trying to be insulting, but he's not exactly in his right mind. There was a lot of drug use, that
Mhm.
happened over years and years and years. And there's some sort of like, paranoid sort of psychosis type of stuff happening. And so after the birth of my daughter, I'd been told by my family for so long, "Oh, your dad's going to change once you have a kid." And so, as much as I say that I didn't cling on to this hope, I did. I very, very
Yeah.
much did. And so, when my daughter was born, there wasn't much of a response from him, which obviously, like, really broke my heart. Then, before we moved here, he wanted to meet up, and so I was excited. I'm like, okay, my dad gets to see me like a dad.
Mhm.
He's never seen me like this. And when we met up, it was him and my grandmother. They, again, talking about the dysfunctional, overbearing mother relationship that's sort of always been there. I could tell there was a lot of discomfort. I could tell that, when we met up, I put a mirror up in front of his face, and I don't think it was very pleasant for him. Obviously, loves my daughter. He was, happy to see her, but you could tell there was like this, his brain was somewhere else. And
Mhm.
my problem for me was like, I had this expectation that things were going to change. I had this
Mhm.
expectation that like, hey, we're going to sit down, we were going to reconcile our differences. He was going to say sorry, and we were going to ride off into the sunset. I think so many men handcuff their progress by having these expectations that really end up disappointing them. You have to understand, and you have no expectations for that
Mhm.
relationship. And once you do, it just, if you have expectations and they're not met, and they're usually not met because again, they're flawed, just like we are, it just leads to way more heartbreak. So after that meeting,
Mhm.
I was hopeful, like, oh, that was really positive. And then, we're supposed to get together one last time before we left, and he canceled last minute. And I'm like, man, like, I was just despondent. I was just
Mhm.
beside myself. And I'm like, it's because I had this expectation, and I knew for myself, I had to have this boundary of like, I can't let this happen to me anymore. I can't have a
Mhm.
relationship like this anymore. That's, based off of broken promises. Cause it's just a reminder of, I have a younger brother, and, my mom and dad divorced early, and there was a lot of trauma that came with that. And I'm so glad my brother doesn't remember a lot of the stuff, but I do, being back and
Mhm.
forth and back and forth. And, there was a lot of times where he just canceled last minute and just wasn't there for us. And it was more so like this buddy friend relationship than it was like, I'm a father, I want to take care of you. And so,
Right.
I kind of got off on a tangent there, but those expectations, to guys out there too, it's just with your dad, if he's a flawed guy, which he probably is if he's human, don't have any expectations. Like, you have to heal that relationship and forgive for yourself, for
Mhm.
yourself. That relationship may
Absolutely.
never be the same, and so it's just about reconciling that difference in your own heart, because it's just, nothing is a greater threat to your own progress as a man. And then you end up recycling those historical traumatic patterns in your own household, which I did, and
Yeah.
was promiscuous and was very angry and very, all of those like sort of toxic hypermasculine traits. And it's funny, the more that you hate something about somebody else, especially your dad, the more you kind of become it, you know?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm still working through that if I were to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I mean, three things came up for me while you were sharing that. And I think, first of all, we, when we're practicing that compassion and empathy for the other person, we have to realize that there's probably shame there. I know for my father, I could tell he was struggling because he knew that there was something I was probably pushing him away or holding back. So he struggled with that, and I could tell he was holding back. And for me, it was like, okay, well, someone's got to do something, and why not me, right? So there's often that shame that comes from the other person too, because they know they probably let someone down, especially if it's your own child. That I've let my child down, how do I show up? And so you have to keep that in mind. The other piece, my therapist told me, like I remember talking to her about it and being like, I think I'm gonna go talk to my dad. And she's like, okay, well, you don't need to. You can write a letter. She gave me, a couple of options. You can write a letter. You can talk to a picture of them. Forgiveness, to your point, is for yourself, right? It's not necessarily for the other person, nor are you letting the other person off the hook by forgiving them. You're basically let, um, freeing yourself. So she kind of shared a couple of other things, and the reason why I mentioned that is for listeners or even yourself. There's other ways you can do that, right? And give that forgiveness out. I know people I've done for other people. I've written letters or typed up an email and never really sent it, but it is therapeutic in that sense. Um, and then there was a third thing I was going to mention, which I kind of forgot now. But
Dude, it's all good. It'll
um,
come back. I just think it's super important too when somebody's thinking about doing that and taking that step to talk to their parent, whether it's their father or their mother, really like you got to really address your intentions as to why,
mhm,
because like a couple of years ago, I reached out to my dad. I was in this kind of like this fork in the road moment in my life. And I reached out to my dad and I told him, I'm like, I'm sorry. I love you. And at the time, dude, like there was these genuine intentions. I'm like, I'm sorry. But then I'm thinking like, man, what am I sorry for?
mhm,
What am I sorry for? Okay, I'm sorry for judging him. I can say that. I'm now learning this in real time on the podcast. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry for judging him harshly. I'm not
yeah,
God, judge him, but I'm reaching out to him, and I didn't reach out to him for just to say that. There was like this like that child in me that wanted dad to just show up finally. And so when he responded, my father has these moments of like lucidity where his real intelligence, he's a very smart man. He's
mhm,
very smart. Just didn't come to the point where he fully realized that proclivity about himself. And there's these moments of lucidity where I see it. I'm like, man, okay, that's the man I want to talk to,
mhm.
but he's guessed as to what version of him I'm going to get when I talk to him. So I think the observing your intentions before you write that letter is super important, just like to protect your own heart, because it could
Yeah,
just make it worse if that expectation isn't met, right? And it's
right,
important to have no expectations with these people, right?
right.
Because they hold so much power over you, whether you want to acknowledge it or not.
Yeah, yeah, and I think boundaries, as you mentioned earlier, is a good way of claiming your power back. Even if you were to forgive, doesn't mean you don't get to have boundaries. It doesn't mean that you don't get to keep your distance, right? If someone is hurting you continuously, you can forgive, but you can also set boundaries, right? So that's kind of one of the things I remind people. The third thing I was going to mention, like it's right now I'm kind of in my last course for school. We've been talking about a lot of family systems and intergenerational trauma, and that's the one thing that keeps coming up is when we don't do these things of healing ourselves, we're not able to differentiate ourselves from that family dynamic. And often if that family dynamic is toxic or if there's a lot of trauma, you're taking that on in your life. And what I see with a lot of people, and myself included, I think what happens is if you're not differentiating yourself, you're not taking responsibility for yourself, and you're often blaming, right? So it's like, oh, villainizing the parent, and then you're playing the victim, and that doesn't really help with your growth. And I think that's the other thing on a subconscious level that came up for me when I was going for therapy is like, okay, yeah, these things were terrible or whatever. From my perspective, they weren't great, but I'm a grown man now, and it's my responsibility to heal and put an end to this. And maybe I put an end to a cycle that was being carried down. I like to believe so, because it's definitely helped me. And for me, it was also important that to your point earlier, I'm not passing that down to my child. I'm sure there's going to be other things that are going to be passed down, but at least this stuff I'm putting an end to because I've become aware of it.
Totally. And so much of what we become is what we tell ourselves about our families and about ourselves. I was, make a post about this very thing is my whole life I've been told by myself and by other people that I'm high strung. And it's
Mm.
like, well, I think that's just an excuse for anger, just to be
Yeah.
angry. Like you're not high strung, dude. What if you spent 20 years telling yourself that you were calm? What if you told yourself for 20 years, telling yourself that like your family was flawed like every other family and you didn't have this super dysfunctional, screwed up family and, woe is me. And to your point too, victimhood mentality is like, talk about handcuffing your growth, whether you're man or woman. If you want to completely just stay in the same place for your whole life, victimize yourself. And I saw this
Mhm.
a lot in my household. And again, this is not to trash my family, is this old school sort of Roman Catholic, Old Testament, I'm below God, like, why is this happening to me? That was like bred in my head for like so many years.
Mhm.
Different than in this area of like, my father. It's like, why me? Why does that person have a dad and why do I have? And then I came to realize, I said, listen, things happen for you, not to you.
Yeah.
And I just reframing that, it's like, okay, well, now I understand. And it's allowed me to step into this role where I'm like, not only do I want to become the man that I like, masculinity is aspirational. It's like something that you never really like get. You don't get to
Right.
like the finish line or like, I'm a man, cool. I get to sit down and rest on my laurels. It's like, not only do I have this aspiration of the man that like I want to become, it's also like, what kind of man did like the 5-year-old me need?
Right.
And in solving that, it's not like the player guy that fills himself with, you know, earthly pleasures because he's so numb and has no purpose. It's like,
Right.
you know, when I think about 5-year-old me, and if I do that for too long, I become emotional. Just like me, I don't know why I picture myself as like a 5-year-old kid sitting in the basement of my dad's house on the couch alone. That's where my head.
Yeah.
And I remember doing this with an exercise with a therapist. It's like, what would you be telling yourself? Man, it's like that's a hard conversation to have.
Mhm.
Just taking away that victimhood mentality and instead looking at it as, okay, this happened for me. What does that mean? That means I have an example of what not to be like. That's a blessing, it's a gift.
Right.
Okay. I have this knowledge of what not to be. So now, even if I don't feel like the opposite, I gotta fake it. If that makes any sense. But what the problem with that is that men like myself, like who are faking it, like you have these blind spots like you don't see, right? And especially until you've stepped into your faith where like now the whole world, you see it with old eyes and new, but then you become so vulnerable to like these red pill tactics. You become
Yeah.
so vulnerable to this manosphere stuff. And you, you see guys like Andrew Tate, and I don't think he's an all around bad guy. I don't. I just think, he's a brilliant marketer, all that stuff. That's a story for a different day, but they
Yeah.
latch onto these ideals of what they think manhood is.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden they're just repeating these past cycles, no different than their own father.
Yeah.
My father didn't know what red pill was, but he was acting that way.
Yeah.
I I figured out what red pill was, and then I just started acting that way.
Mhm.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So, without something to ground us as, like, young males, we tend to latch on to, like, the worst things. That's why young men become gangsters, right? Because they
Mhm.
see men, that's the only brotherhood that they know. And so now we have this world that's void of fatherhood, but it's also void of brotherhood.
Yep. Yep.
And that's why these conversations are so healing. Because
Absolutely.
not enough men are bringing their trauma to the table and saying, "Hey, this is what I've struggled with for so long, and in fact, it keeps me up at night and makes me cry my eyes out."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so go ahead.
No, I was just gonna add to your point. I think it all circles back to taking responsibility for yourself. And, you were touching on the whole concept of masculinity. I think so many men are lost because they're trying to define masculinity for themselves. And it's like, to me personally, what makes it so simple is I'm not striving to fit any label of masculinity. For me, it's just maintaining humility in my life. And, if I want to cry, I will cry, but that doesn't mean I'm less masculine. It's like, well, I'm humble enough to accept that there is an emotion that I'm feeling. And however that emotion needs to be felt, I'm going to let it feel, I'm going to let myself feel it that way without any judgment. But I think a lot of guys, because they haven't taken that responsibility, they're either like living a life of nihilism or hedonism because they're just trying to seek out pleasure to numb that pain, or nihilism through, oh, my life is just depressing and what's the point of all of this? And I think until you don't find meaning, and there's meaning behind every situation. And for me, going back to this whole experience with my father, there was meaning in it because perhaps it was meant for me to end the generational trauma. And
Yeah.
there's so much meaning behind that if you choose to look at it that way, right? But I think to your point earlier, it's also understanding that often one of the things I've started to internalize more lately, it's taken me a while to get that here, but we often judge other people based on the things we hate about ourselves. And when
Yeah.
you really sit down and, you know, let that one sink, it's huge. And I've let that one sink and I'm now starting to catch myself. And I don't judge myself. I kind of have to have compassion for myself too. So if I see another dude and I'm judging him, now I'm able to stop and think about, okay, what's about that person that's irritating me? And how am I also demonstrating that behavior? When do I do that? And why is it so irritating to me about myself? And immediately I'm able to not only stop judging the other person and have compassion for them, but I'm able to look at it, look at myself in the mirror and find that opportunity for growth. And I think when we start looking at our parents that way, it can make a huge difference because quite often we do inherit their personality traits and then we judge them for it. Well, meanwhile, we know it's something we don't like about ourselves.
Totally. And also too, recognizing that the gifts that we've been given are partly in due to both mother and father. And so that's another thing too, that has helped me reconcile, my relationship with my dad is that, hey, listen, like I've gotten some positive things from him. And I've only recently started to like identify what those things are. So it's like, it's not all bad. Whatever good is inside of you is partly the good that's been instilled by your dad, whether directly or indirectly through speech or whatever, or just pure, genetics. It's like, I've learned to not resent the fact that I walk like my dad. I don't
Mhm,
resent the fact that like I talk like my dad because I'm the charismatic guy. And so
mhm,
there's positive things there. Right. And then to your point too, about being the one to break generational trauma, I recently read this book by Ed Milet. It's called The Power of One More. And in that book, there was a chapter about the Matrix and Neo. And in the movie, what do we remember about Neo? He was the one, right?
mhm.
And I believe every family has the one in their family tree. We just have to be the ones to like identify that. And the one meaning the person that breaks that curse, breaks that cycle. For me, it was like finding out, man, I did this family tree exercise with a therapist a few years ago. And I found out that I was like the only dude that didn't, I wasn't unfaithful to a woman at any point. I was the only man in like multi generations that like I've been close before, but I've never been truthfully unfaithful to a woman. Like I've never, cheated on a woman before. I'm like, man, okay, cool. I'll take that. I'll put that feather in my cap. And I think,
Yeah.
more guys took that upon themselves. And it's again, to your point, when it comes back down to responsibility, as personal responsibility. That's why guys like Jordan Peterson are as famous as he is, because he's brought that simple concept of personal responsibility back to the forefront. And now I
Absolutely.
think he gets lost in the weeds by focusing too much on the self. And I think we are more a collective. Like there's no such thing as the lone wolf, bro. Like
Yeah.
I made a post about that. It's like, there's no such thing. That's like something that the internet fetishizes because we're so isolated because of this technological dominance, but we need tribe. We need brotherhood. We
Yeah.
need a collective of males that come together that aspire to a greater purpose.
Mhm.
But we also need that brotherhood to help, repair brokenness too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, around the whole lone wolf concept, all the research I've done over the last couple of years around addiction, any kind of addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, porn, we're all seeking connection in a way.
Yeah.
And because we're not meant to be isolated and alone, so we kind of numb ourselves through these addictions or certain traits or habits, because at the end of the day, we are seeking connection, and we are, it's that collective consciousness that we talk about, or people talk about. We are all in one form unity, right? And how you find that in your life, and often people get lost, right, through other things. But at the end of the day, they're seeking that connection, and until they don't realize what they're seeking, they're continuing to repeat those patterns and those habits. And it's only when they're able to focus on that connection piece, whether it's through community, family, friends, that's where it's healing. And a lot, I see that a lot, even in the men's groups I'm part of. We see that when the men show up, they feel that sense of community now, and it's really helped their growth. It's helped them show up as better fathers, better husbands. And it's so important, as you mentioned, that, we're not meant to be isolated. We're meant to be connected with people.
Yeah, and that brotherhood also helps us realize whether or not we're living a lie, dude. I can speak to myself in like my history with red pill and sexual promiscuity and all this stuff. Was I was trying to play the role that society wanted to, assign me, right? Like my whole life, people were, especially after I lost, over 100 pounds, and now I started, females started actually paying attention to me. People were, would tell me, "Hey, Mike, you're a decent looking guy. Go and sow your wild oats, see if the shoe fits." And I literally lived my life for so many years according to other people's standards, and then I didn't realize. And I look back and reflecting on all those little, those sexual escapades. I was always intoxicated, whether it was drugs or alcohol. There was always a sense of shame afterwards, and I didn't actually like it. I didn't actually like it. I numbed myself to do this because it was like, okay, another notch, another thing. And but what I would find is when I would talk to these women before we would do this, because I was raised by with my grandfather was an immigrant, and my mother, there's this more empathic side to myself that I have. So I would really like pick up these little cues from these women that I'm like, man, you're hurt, like you're really hurt, and like you're seeing
Mm.
something that's not there. It's
Right.
not there. And you can see it. And like, it's like a mirror in front of my face where, there's probably a lot more guys out there that are, conducting their lives this way and they haven't even realized it. And
Yep.
so, right. And so I realized that I'm more of an empath. I am a compassionate person. I do emote a little bit more. Those times, like I struggle with, porn addiction, and that caused some erectile dysfunction through my
Mhm.
teens and my 20s. But what also helped perpetuate this issue was like showing up doing these things. And I'm like, man, I'm actually not into this. This is performative. This is like a sport. And I
Yeah.
wasn't into it. There was this disconnection from mind, body, and spirit completely because I was living a lie. And also too, this like massive suppression of emotions. Like, to your point about tears, bro, like for so long I would tell guys like, you're quote unquote a bitch, bro. If you cry,
Mhm.
there's nothing bitch like about that. It's just obviously context, how you do it, how often you do it. They matter, of course. Like nobody wants to see a man cry all the time. But at the same time, like I've allowed my wife to see me tear up. Like those emotions are real. And actually what I found was that as soon as I embraced the fact that I am a bit more of an emotive person, if I do, like I'm a musician, I'm a creative person at heart. So when I hear the right song, it reminds me of this time, I'll start to tear up. If the end of Armageddon makes me cry, you know what I'm saying? But am I sitting there
Yeah.
bawling? No, I'm not. But like to feel those things, like when somebody passes or when something traumatic happened, my wife's seen me tear up. When my daughter gave me a hug and a kiss and called me dad for the first time and I teared up, like that's very real. And there's nothing emasculating about it. And in fact, that allowed me to get closer to my wife.
Mhm.
I didn't see this like, oh, she respects me less. Now, if
Mhm.
I was a blubbering fool all the time, maybe she would. But
Right.
the fact that I'm not, and those things, like how many guys are living lies? They're being players, and they're pretending they're these stoic philosophers when they're not.
Yeah.
And they just have to embrace those things, right?
Yeah. I mean, and going back to the whole idea of flawed and vulnerable, I think when you're able to show your emotions in real time, again, it's hard for other people not to consider you as a human, right? And not have that connection. I mean, I'm sure that's what your wife would feel like. Oh, he's human after all, right? And he's showing the emotions. And it's so important for us to show our emotions because otherwise you repress them. And similar to whatever you're repressing when you're seeking out pleasure or whatever it is, you're just disassociating from yourself, and it creates, I think, internal chaos, which we don't necessarily realize, and that's where I think it becomes a cycle. You know, because you're experiencing that chaos, you continue to numb and numb and numb, and it becomes a never ending cycle, unfortunately. And it was a cycle I was on for a while too, and until I realized that, you know, I had 2 choices: break that cycle or
Yeah.
continue it and go down this deep, dark hole that is continuing to get deeper and deeper. The more I continue down this cycle, and it was so important for me to put an end to it and really find myself and ground myself. Um, and I don't think I've figured it all out because I still have bouts with my ego, and my ego tempts me or persuades me in different directions that I know I shouldn't be following, but sometimes it's hard. Especially when you're at your most vulnerable moments, your ego will come up and try to pull you. So it's being aware of it and mindful of it for sure.
1000%, man. And the only, I kind of accidentally stumbled into it. I've always thought of myself to be a self-aware person, but it wasn't until that I met my wife and, we had a baby that I was like, oh, damn, this is real now. Like I gotta figure myself out big time. And there was like, there's these series of events that, and the commonality between all those events is that it produced pressure. They produced, um, stress, good, positive stress. Like for a man to really step into his manhood, he's got to put his back against the flame, right? So here I am, this young man, and my wife, girlfriend at the time, I got married to her like a month later. I was like, I was operating sort of blind, but the first push was her hovering above me and saying, "We're pregnant." I'm like, "Oh, dude, I can't be living for myself anymore." And that was the great awakening, is that we're walking around living solely for like the temple of I, when really like that fulfillment and that like actualization of our character and our manhood, and also that reconciliation between ourselves and our relationship with our fathers, I think it becomes healed through a process of pressure. And what that implies is that you're taking like extreme accountability and
Yeah.
ownership over yourself or the situation that you're in. And so if it wasn't for my wife, and I just prayed God every day that, he gave me a good woman. I don't know what I did to deserve that after what all that I've done, but it's certainly without that catalyst for change for me, I wouldn't have been able to step into this. And so it sounds like for you, tell me if I'm wrong, that started with you talking to your dad, correct?
Well, I think it wasn't one thing.
Yeah, it's
I
a
think,
series of things usually, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And to your point, I'm also very grateful and consider myself fortunate to be able to go through those experiences through life. And there's different moments where different things happen, but it's kind of part of your hero's journey where one aspect of it is, repairing and forgiving your father or whatever it is. There's different obstacles along the way, like I mentioned, um, and then there's more coming on this journey. That's the thing. I think as men, once we take responsibility for ourselves, we're able to, as you mentioned earlier, recognize that things do happen for us, not to us. And there's more agency in that because then we're not saying, "Hey, I'm a victim. Um, I'm part of the effect." It's like, no, I'm the cause of these
Yes.
things that manifest themselves. And I think then you can even reframe and shift how your life plays out because you maintain that level of positivity as well as discipline or control, whatever it takes. But that's kind of how I approach life is like, okay, well, there's certain things that are going to happen throughout the day I have no control over, but the only thing I can control is how I'm showing up. And sometimes I'm going to miss the mark. Sometimes I'm going to, you know, as a flawed human, I'm going to make mistakes, but it's also recognizing that at the end of the day, I'm looking back at all the mistakes I made and how can I improve on them. And sometimes it takes me many, many tries, but yeah.
Really, that's the process of just life in general and growth. And a lot of times, like, for me, I think the downfall of man is temper and is lust, and without touching on the point of lust yet, but talking about anger, and anger in most situations is a choice.
Mhm.
Just like that lie that I've fed myself for so long that I'm high strung or I'm this or I'm that. I'm like, man, it's all a choice. And like, look no further than a stupid example that is like road rage, right?
Yeah.
Like, dude, like it's like something goes off in a human's mind as soon as he gets behind the wheel of a car that just makes you a tyrant.
Right.
And you don't realize it, but you're choosing to be that way.
Yep.
Of course there's normal human anger, right? Like we all succumb to it at some point for sure. Like that's, I'm not gonna be one of these guys that like all anger is a choice. Like, no, man, anger is like part of like the human psyche and it's okay.
Of course.
We deal with that. That's important. Like there's normal, male anger, female anger, but most anger, most things are a choice, dude. And it wasn't until I realized this that I was able to really heal my household too. It was
Right.
like, man, when I come home from work, man, put the armor down, put the weapon down at the door, dude. Like, you don't know what kind of day your wife's had or your daughter's had. Like, go in there and just be bright, positive, happy, and loving as much as you can be. And if your wife ticks you off, your kid ticks you off, like, just take a split second. And again, referring back to that book, because I think that book was just so the power of one more. It's just be calm one more time. And that's my
Mhm.
mantra. Like, just choose mercy and choose forgiveness before you choose anger. Just like don't go there yet.
Yeah.
Use
Yeah.
something unique, you know, and it's hard. It's so hard because you feel those emotions bubbling up. But we honestly, truthfully, the more I grow older, the more I realize it's a choice. And it's just we've been fooled to think that like our emotions happen and we're victims of circumstance when really we are like the masters of our own domain. And
Mm.
that's like between the ears and in the rib cage,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point, anger is very informative, right? I think part of it is we've looked at anger as this negative emotion, and then it becomes anytime anyone experiences anger, there's so much shame around and you try to hide it. And I've said this a few times, but shame thrives on secrets and silence.
Yeah.
So it continues to perpetuate. But I think it's recognizing, okay, what is this anger telling me? And whether, to your point, if you're feeling like a tyrant or you're lashing out based on your anger, there's some sort of insecurity behind that. And it's recognizing, where's that insecurity coming from? Like for me, road rage was before I would consider myself weak. It's like, oh, this guy cut me off, or this guy gave me the finger. He thinks I'm weak. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I'll show him, right? And it's
That's
like,
right.
oh no, this guy's probably having a terrible day. Or it's first thing in the morning and this guy's so angry, I feel compassion for him, because how terrible must it be that first thing in the morning you're getting so enraged that you have to flip someone off, right? So it's just reframing it rather than taking it personally, because often when we personalize it, there's so much insecurities attached to it. So it's to your point, pausing and just taking that moment to recognize, what is this anger trying to tell me?
And it's amazing when, even on the road, for example, when somebody's like super flippant and they're mad and you actually meet them with like calmness, they change instantly.
Yeah.
They're expecting you to be hostile, right? And when you're not, and you're like, no, no, my weapon's down, man. Their demeanor
Yeah.
changes. Amazing. It's amazing how that happened. I think for us to get there, fundamentally, our ego has to die. Because if you look at like the calamity of man, like the war that wages within a man's heart, it's usually because of his ego. He
Yep.
feels slighted by his wife. He feels slighted by his friend. He feels, underappreciated in his workplace, whatever. It's like all an ego battle. And once, and for me, all men come to that ego death in their own way, or sometimes they never do. And that's what perpetuates these generational curses, right? For me, it
Yep.
was bad. As soon as I like emerged from that water, I was like, I'm like a baby now. And in my
Mm.
head, I didn't want to be one of those Christians that was like, okay, I got baptized and I'm just doing the same crap. No, I
Yep.
felt convicted that I must live in a different way and I must put to death this ego. And it's just, and in the Bible, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? But it essentially, if you can break it down, even if you're not a Christian, is like the death of your ego is the beginning of wisdom.
Mm.
Here's who you are. I
Yep.
saw myself, I tattooed all these symbols all over my body because I didn't believe it in my heart. So I had to look at it on my skin.
Mm.
Hard realization to come to, you know? That's a hard
Yeah.
realization. Like, you're the reason your life is screwed up. You're the reason your wife resents you. You're the reason that your kids are scared to talk to you when you come home. But it's only then with that ego death are you able to, emerge like, like the phoenix out of the ashes, this new being, because that old skin fundamentally had to die,
Yeah.
has to. And I actually take back what I said. The downfall of man is not temper or lust, it's ego.
Yeah, and temper and lust are part of the ego, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I feel I get tested the most. But yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, Mike. And I know we're getting close on time here. I just want to end off with one last question. But as a father now yourself, if you are, compelled to share, what are the things that you're focusing on as a father now for your daughter, and if there's going to be more kids in the picture? But yeah, what do you focus on, and what's kind of the legacy you want to pass on to your daughter?
God willing, we want to have more kids. But for me, my whole thing is I don't ever want my daughter being attracted to the younger version of me.
Mm,
So my whole life is centered around how can I show her the love of Christ, the way that Christ loved the church. I show her that by loving her mom more than anything else in this world, and showing her that in my behaviors, and being calm, quick to forgive, and slow to anger, and really, really, like, even if I don't believe it, being the man I want her to show up with and marry. I want that man to be so much better than me. But it's only because I set that example where, when she's older, she doesn't need to be validated by anybody but herself and by God and her parents. And
mhm.
so only thing I'm focusing on is healing my own childhood trauma, healing my relational trauma and my attachment style, so I can show up as, like, the most actualized man and example for her. That's all that I want, because, when I had a kid, we were all convinced when, my wife was pregnant, we didn't find out the gender. I was convinced it was a boy. Everybody was convinced it was a boy, except for my wife. And then so when I found out it was a girl, like, dude, that was part of the ego death too, was like, how arrogant was I to think that I had the right and the privilege, and that, like, I was entitled to raise a boy into a man. I wasn't fully a man yet. So when she
Mm,
out, I was like, dude, all the bad stuff I did to women, and now I have a little girl. Oh my God. There's nothing more sobering for a man than that.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
if I ever find out my little girl's on Tinder, then I know I've failed straight up. So that's what I'm focused on, is just being the
yeah.
best we can be for her. And that starts by, you know, taking responsibility, loving her mom, and loving God more than anything else in this world.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Mike. Appreciate it, and thank you for coming on here and being so vulnerable and honest. I really appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation today. For listeners that do want to get a hold of you, what are some ways they can do that? Whether it's social media, online, yeah, how can they
I
do
just
that?
want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show, dude. Like, you, Kurt, and John Waltz have had me on their podcast in the last week and a half, and my page is so small, but just to see other guys like yourself recognize, some of the value, and at least the heart of what I'm doing is good, and seeing that recognized means a lot to me. So sincerely, thank you. It's amazing to be amongst men like yourself. But where to find me is, my fitness stuff is Forza Barbell, but my main stuff where I'm posting most of the time is just my page on Instagram is Mike Pantile. So it's Mike, and then it's spelled Pantile. So Pantile on Instagram. And that's where mainly I post, content about faith, motivation, fatherhood, and sort of everything in between. So you can find me there.
Cool. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you, bro. God bless you. We'll talk soon again.
Thanks.
Thank you for checking out this episode with Mike. Please subscribe to the podcast if you already haven't done so, and please leave a comment. I always love hearing from you. Stay tuned for another episode next week.